Look closely, these are different people groups. So we're mostly going to be talking about the Inuit. And people get way into, or they get a little bit confused about the Arctic because a lot of things can't grow there. That is true. There's a lot of snow and ice there, and that is true. And so we get confused and we think that because of its harsh monotony, that life is going to be the same everywhere in the Arctic, and that the people are all going to be the same too. And that's actually not true. We are going to be talking about the Inuit for the most part, but there are a number of language families and a number of languages, depending on how you're accounting. There are about 40 different language groups. Some people would say as many as 90 different languages spoken in this region. So there's a lot of there is a lot of variation in terms of climate, maybe not climate, but in terms of the people. And so don't fall into the trap that there is simply a monoculture in terms of the vegetation or the groups. And there's going to be differences within those groups as well. So just a little bit of when we're making generalizations about a large area of the world like this, keep in mind that there's a lot of different people groups that we can include and group differently in the Arctic. The title of this chapter is called Arctic Zones, and so that could include the Antarctic as well, and every so often we'll pop down to the Antarctic for some evidence from, say, the Antarctic psychologists. But for the most part, we'll be talking about a place where people can and have lived, the Arctic, and for the most part, we'll be talking about the Inuit. But just keep in your heads that there are different peoples who have migrated in, migrated out, changed. People have been around in different ways for a long time as you're looking at this. Now, when we think about the Arctic, Tyler, you said that the most important sentence, the most important thing you could possibly think of in the Arctic was what? Keeping warm, right? Adaptation to cold stress. So Tyler says this is the most important thing. And I mean, yeah, you got to keep warm, and it is actually easier to die of cold than it is to die of heat. You can die of both, but apparently more people still die of cold than they do of heat. So the most important sentence for Tyler was about keeping warm. Now, there are some biological ways, Jacob, that the people in the Arctic seem to be able to keep warm. And then babies have adapted to it like 7 times as efficiently as adults. Oh, those neat babies. Yeah, this is called non-shivering thermogenesis. So we can shiver to increase our body heat, but it's better if we don't shiver using, I don't know, brown fat or something to be able to increase our metabolic rate without being able to shiver. Apparently in the Arctic, probably by exposing themselves to the cold, probably, they are able to maintain better non-shivering thermogenesis than if you don't grow up in the Arctic and you don't expose yourself to the cold. Of course, we could just go outside and see if we can work on our non-shivering thermogenesis right now, but it's probably a little bit late for us. Helps if you're a baby. Now, yeah, you have to be a little bit careful with that, Jacob. It turns out, I think if I read it correctly, it's that babies can do this 7 times more efficiently than adults anywhere. And if they keep being raised in the Arctic, then they maintain that efficiency at a higher rate than, say, me. But I was a little bit, I didn't delve into the original study. I don't know. Yeah. Huh? Oh. Yeah, maybe I might just have to reread what you wrote. That's how you read it too.
Yeah.
The babies are better at it. Goes away for us adults, but in the Arctic they hang on. I might have, yeah. I may have overstated it as well. Now we don't know. I mean, there's some unknowns here. People are like, is that because they're exposed themselves to the cold? They're always out there hunting and stuff, as you said, or is it because they have a more protein-rich diet? And I guess the reason I want to be careful with this, and maybe I read too closely into your words, Jacob, is because what we used to think about the Inuit and their how wonderful the Inuit were. Jacob, what did we used to think about? No, not Jacob. Louis, what did we used to think about the Inuit and their adaptation to the cold?
I think that, like what I was writing about, was the whole
Yeah, we used to think. You're about to say, tell us more about this, but the thing you're about to tell us is not what I'm going to say, which is we used to think that it was all genetics, right? We used to think, they're born up there. They must have something in their genes, or it's because of some morphological. But what did you find out?
well, like the genetic predisposition thing, like I didn't really like. I know what you're saying. I like the way I read it was like the whole like the fact that their faces were like, I guess, geographically flatter than like other like people nearby. Like I would have thought that that made it harder to be, existing up north because of, like wind shear and stuff, and like maybe like the flatter facial geography like make your more prone to hypothermia or something. And then he talked about like the goggles and like the use of face masks was like higher because of that.
Yeah, we used to get all excited about how, stocky the Inuit were and how that must be some sort of genetic adaptation and how their eyes were shaped, and that might be some genetic morphological adaptation. But we've come along and said, nah, actually, they were pretty trim and pretty fit. And now they're using goggles and visors all the time. So that eye thing must not have been genetic or morphological. So what I'm saying is, it seems like, and that's why you always have to be careful, because people are often trying to ascribe genetic adaptation to something that is often just an effect of growing up in that environment, or maybe has no effect at all. Now, this will become important too when we talk about high altitude adaptations, because there is always this debate about what happens genetically to people over time that are raised, this for Thursday, in mountainous high altitude areas, and what happens biologically, and what happens when you simply move from one mountainous area or from the coast to the mountains again. So it's something to just keep your eye on. In the case of the Arctic, at least from my reading of this seems to be something that is more something that comes from being in the cold, as opposed to some sort of special genetic adaptation to the cold. There's other things that they do, though. Anna, what else do they do? Help protect from the cold instead of all this shivering and stuff. All right, so the traditional clothing part of things, and being able to have those special kinds of boots and skins and stuff that was smart to dress up in so that you could avoid the cold. And Victoria, you got really interested in something else that they did, which is what?
Like their parkas, or if they ever got wet, then they would have to hang dry them and wait for the water to freeze, and then they would like beat the water out of them, or like the freeze out of them. Then they would scrape them afterwards to re-stretch them.
Yeah, it did seem really interesting. And he kept asking a bunch of questions like, do they do it up and down or side to side? And how do they scrape them? And does this do that? And I had no idea. And I couldn't learn because I was learning about the angle of the Canada part and the Minnesota. But if you want to learn about this, if you're interested, I'm sure somebody must have a YouTube video of beating the frost out of some parka or something, and you could link to it and show us, and then we'd know if it was done like this or like that, and how much scraping you have to do, and if it makes how often you can do that before your stuff wears out, because it's kind of like putting it through the washing machine on cycles. You don't want your clothes to wear out too fast. I don't know how many times you can beat that thing. Does it just get better and better? Yeah, all these questions that you have and I have, but my job was to do Minnesota. Your job is to find us. I mean, maybe that's your research paper. Maybe that's what you want to know, is about the Inuit and the clothes and how to do that. I don't know. You're acting like you don't want to do the Inuit for your paper, but I'm just putting it out there. You may need that. What else, Liz? What can they do? Oh yeah, today this has gone down a lot, and probably that commercial clothing, which who wants to be beating the frost out of things? That sounds like a lot of work. And so now you just buy a parka and it's not quite as good. You can also have, I guess we've already talked about the traditional shelters and the igloos, and and I made fun of Mickey for talking about having a wood fire in the house and a furnace, but in fact, in an igloo, you probably need that inside. You have to be careful, of course, but yeah, you can't have a heat pump in an igloo. That's not going to work. I know that. You can have a cold climate heat pump, but it's not going to work in an igloo. So there's traditional shelter and these kinds of things. And it is true that these things have diminished in use over the years. Let's see, this was on page 113. Let's see, purchase commercial parkas made from nylon and other fabrics. This has gone along with greater dependence on overheated housing. Probably what we have much of the time, overheated housing, and reduced exposure to the elements through reduced subsistence hunting. So they're not going out as much to expose themselves to the elements and get that non-shivering thermogenesis because of the reduction of that. Now, don't get down on them. These things are very difficult to do, and sometimes you just want to buy a parka and live in a house, man. Constructing these things is difficult to do. But yeah, there's variation in how this has been used. Now, we talked a little bit about this. This is what scares me of going to Alaska or even Dublin, is the prolonged light and darkness. The light period is fun and you get to have lots of raves and parties, but the dark period is a long time of being dark. Naya, you talked to us about these Antarctic psychological researchers who talk about all the bad stuff that can happen during the winter. But Moran tells us that that's mostly because of prolonged confinement, social and related to prolonged confinement. So that's an interesting finding. You had a different experiment, though, that you were telling me about. I was learning. What was that?
And they have no like websites and talks about their information. And they have to stay there for 40 days, and they're like bodies with them. They got used to being in the bed, basically, and like they have to basically put like they have to make their own food and do their own things, and like they weren't like allowed to with anyone else out or like touch anyone. So you could be for like 30 hours and you wouldn't know.
That's super interesting. I'm a little suspicious of these guys. Is there any reason we should be suspicious of them? Huh? probably have, no, they're not allowed to have phones, see? That's not a part. I mean, the first reason we're suspicious of them is because they're French, that's obvious, so I'll take that one. But there's something else about this. I mean, I love psychological studies and all, but is this the winter?
Right now, like in this weather pattern, probably not considered.
Huh?
They're open caves over there.
Yeah, they're in a cave. And it's only 40 days. What kind of winter is 40 days? That's like the shortest winter ever. That's nothing, man. When you're down in the doing the 6, 8, 7, 8, 9 months of winter, then you can talk to me about, I don't know. It's interesting. It is interesting, these studies that are done, but you just have to, you know, take them with a grain of salt. Plus, they're volunteers. They wanted to go in the cave. They wanted to get a lot of sleep. You know, it's always difficult in anthropology and other social sciences because you can design experiments that try to replicate various conditions, but then there's all kinds of other limiting factors. So it's hard to say what exactly is going on here. If you can do this, though, I would definitely do it. You can go in a cave for 40 days and be isolated. Go for it. Ah, this. Yeah. John, you're really interested in this.
Yeah. Let me go grab it.
Yeah, this made me nervous. This
Yeah,
was
this,
this was part of the light and darkness thing. And I think in a previous class, I told you that I could just pop a bunch of vitamin D and sit under a heat lamp or an LED and I'd be fine. But it turns out I might not be fine because I'm talking too fast. There's nothing funny about Arctic hysteria. Arctic hysteria. I'm going to tell you about Arctic hysteria, and then you're going to tell me about the thing that you talk the most about. It's a temporary mental disorder characterized by alterations in consciousness, memory loss, psychomotor seizures, and other symptoms typical of epilepsy. And that sounds like a bummer. And it happens to the people who live in these places as well, the Inuit themselves. I mean, people would observe them doing this. Interestingly, it encompasses two general types of behavior: imitative mania and frenzied disassociated states. The former is confined to Siberia, while the latter is found throughout the Arctic. So we have some, I don't know why some people in Siberia would be a certain way, and then the other way would be throughout the Arctic. And sometimes it's more with women than men. And Zeke? It sounds like it could be, doesn't it? It sounds similar to something like that. I don't know. Maybe we'll read about that in the mountains. John, what do you got?
Well, there's something about like, I think it's Moran, the urinary, it talks about like the leak of like calcium from the body, the removal of like calcium that's needed from the body causes, like we talked about before, it gets into hyper Arctic hysteria a little bit, that's a little bit cool.
Yeah, no, you were very interested in the urinary excretion of calcium and the urinary potassium and all that
I
stuff.
wish you did.
Yeah, there's something weird going on there. It's more than just being able to, like I said, it's more than being able to pop vitamin D. And so it's a serious thing that requires adaptability. You know, it's hard to say, you know, I mean, there's different ways in which this is expressed. They said it might be a way in which Inuit reacted to intense stress. It might be that it was more prevalent in women than men, but is that because of the biological stuff or because of the social stuff? Hard to say, right? But it definitely, yeah, it does make me wonder if, you know, people should be living up there. Like, yeah. Well, what's the difference? Well, let's read here. Arctic hysteria encompasses two general types of behavior. Imitative mania.
That mean like somebody doing like serious stuff and then they start doing it?
That sounds like imitative mania to me. And frenzied disassociated states. That sounds like more like what Zeke was talking about. Yeah.
Maybe it's like the thing where like an alien invades and then nobody knows who the alien is.
Like the thing.
Yeah.
That movie?
Yeah.
It's
Oh, a movie. I don't know that movie. I have to watch it. I'm just gonna say the former. So imitative mania is confined to Siberia, while the latter is found throughout the Arctic. So that means everybody can go into frenzied disassociated states, but only in Siberia do they have the imitative mania, or at least that's been documented there. I don't know. This is super interesting. Might be a good paper for somebody. Zeke, tell us about hunting. Yeah, there's various ways to, help those poor children adapt to the environment by playing games and sports and getting them trained up to be able to hunt and do these things so that they can go out there and do the hunting. And you mentioned the spirits part of this, which is, it's an interesting thing about hunting in general, and especially hunting in the circumpolar region in the Arctic. This is what we in the United States, in North America, we call these caribou, but they live throughout the region. In Europe, we call them caribou if they're wild and reindeer when they're domesticated, which is kind of funny. But the Europeans only call them reindeer. Same animal, just different things that we say. Anyway, these animals live there in the in the Arctic region and are a common thing, common non-human animal that they like to hunt. In my previous version of cultural ecology, I've started with this slide and the caribou turning its eyes toward the hunter. And apparently this is, in evolutionary terms, a really interesting response that has developed, is that if you are pursuing a caribou, there's this moment when the caribou turns to face you and stares right in your eye. And apparently, the evolutionary biologists tell us that this is an adaptation to being hunted by wolves, and that a fit caribou can outrun a wolf. And so this is this crucial moment when the wolf can find the caribou, because for wolves, they can easily find the caribou, but they're very difficult to kill because the caribou turns and faces the wolf, marking this final sort of pause before the caribou is going to run and the wolf is going to run and the caribou can win. So there's this final point where they lock gazes. However, if this is a human being and I've been pursuing this caribou, which is very difficult to find, but I finally found one and the caribou turns to me and looks at me in the eye, what do? Yeah, it's the moment at which, it's an easy shot. So for humans, caribou are difficult to find, but difficult to find, but easy to kill. Whereas for wolves, they are easy to find, but hard to kill. Now, the people who hunt them interpret this turn and the gaze as a moment that the animal has given itself up to the hunter in the spirit of regeneration and love. And if you don't get this, you're not allowed to take the animal. You're not supposed to take it. And it has to do with the idea that hunting, actually, and this in many hunting societies, is essentially considered to be a non-violent act. It is not a moment of violence. It is not a moment of killing. It is a moment of regeneration and love, and is more linked to, say, sexual intercourse than it is to killing and violence. So this is the moment of love when the animal gives itself up, and now you know that you participate in the rhythm of life. John, you look puzzled.
So the like equivalent exchange where one takes in and it gets replaced by the other. Kind of so like the caribou, like they interpret as caribou exchanging its life for another moment. Kind of like that.
Right, for the sustenance of life, and in some ways, well, now I'm going further into this. This is where I got all philosophical. In this world, life is not actually a property of the thing. We are in the spirit of life, and so that we are both participating in this regenerative process. And so, in fact, to live or to die is we are being animated by life itself, which is all around us. And so, in some ways, it's giving itself up, but not even in the sense of it's turning itself into something else.
It's like type of ways that really life is only transferred into something else, like our chemicals are made of certain chemicals. Like when we die, our chemicals don't really go anywhere. They just adapt to whatever plants and kind of recycling of what.
Sure. I mean, if you want to be all biological about it, every cell in our bodies is being regenerated and is all new every 7 years or so. So, anyway. So people like to study hunting, and hunting is very, very, very important in these societies. I was sad, though, to see that nobody wanted to talk about the berries. Berries are also very important. And, maybe they don't tell so many stories about the berries, and the berries don't get to gaze at you in the eye. But we should pay attention to the berries. I've left some references in there. In other times, I might take all those references out because I can, but just in case you want to write a paper about the berries, because we've now been thinking about plants and berries and all those things. So we should mention that it's not just the reindeer and the caribou and the polar bear, walruses, whatever's up there. Also, nobody wanted to talk about the snowmobiles. Maybe because we don't want to get down on Inuit and we think of them like walking around in their traditional clothing and beating the ice out of their traditional clothing and having little tiny lamps in their little igloos and being all nice and harmonious with nature. And it turns out, look at page 129, that even, boy, way before you were even born, by 1969, how many years ago is that? 53 years. By 1969, the switch from dog sledding to snowmobiles was complete. Inuits stopped walking and drove everywhere on their machines, even if their destination was only 1 block away in the village. Whoa, hey, that sounds not very nice to the environment. I'm just going to hop on my snowmobile. Or as my Italian grandfather told me once when I was trying to get him to walk around, he said, "Wow, no, walk? What are you talking about? Drive." Now I'm trying to recapture the Mediterranean diet and go outside and walk around and all that stuff. And he's like, drive a big car. Anyway, the snowmobiles also, it turns out, then they started to break down, and that was a problem too. And as they said, they exacerbate or drive up the class distinctions because they become a status symbol. They're expensive to maintain. But they have been adopted throughout the Arctic. And I guess I would say that now, after 50 years or so, they're used to do things like herd reindeer and caribou and hunt and do these kinds of things. They can be bad, sure, but people have incorporated them into their, what we might call now, they are thoroughly part of traditional lifestyles, which brings us to a point about the idea of tradition and the idea of modernization. And we read in this last part about the internet and about the snowmobiles and about the parkas and about building houses and about all these things that people have adopted that are, you know, maybe in some ways bad. But, well, I guess I would say, what would you say to this, Autumn? Is everything gone? Is it all done up there in the Arctic? No. What's going on?
Push more and spread out more with the internet, new technology, so they can share those things. They're able to keep their traditional ways, but also adopt newer ways to further their values.
Yeah, that was a very important point. You used a quote I think is extremely important. I mean, certainly when a lot of times this happens a lot all over. You bring in something new and everybody gets a snowmobile and then they're like, I'm not walking, I'm taking this snowmobile and I'm not going to walk anymore. But it turns out that over time, people figure out, oh, wait a second, maybe that's not the best idea. We can use it here, but we don't want to use it all the time. Maybe phone, you know, it's kind of like when the cell phone first came out. Like, look, I'm looking out at you and I don't see too many people texting right now. Boy, oh boy, in the early days, it would be like impossible. We'd all be texting right now. Even I couldn't stop. Right? So, you know, eventually you kind of work it in. And so it's just a part of your life. It's not like dominating your life anymore. And the same way in the Arctic. I mean, it's there, people are similar in all parts of the world. I mean, oftentimes you want to have a nice jacket and you don't want to have to beat the ice out of it, but then you realize, well, wait a second, some of those jackets were, or some of those traditional clothes might have been good, and we don't want to lose that knowledge, and maybe we should incorporate that into our lives as well. And so I think what we're seeing in the Arctic is this balancing out. It may not be fast enough, or it may proceed at different rates, but it is certainly happening, and people are always meshing together their tradition and their modernization practices. And often things like the internet, for example, can spread or help to preserve different kinds of customs and ideas at times when they might be lost. So when Victoria tells us how we can use the ice and finds us a YouTube video on how to do that, we're all going to know how to do that, and then we'll have a new custom that we can use. Now, I must admit that when I was reading this chapter for the first time, all of a sudden I thought, the Arctic, oh God, it sounds terrible up there. There's too much darkness all the time and all that urine excreting calcium, and the next thing you know, you're in Arctic hysteria and imitative mania. I don't want to do it, and it's just going to warm up anyway, and all the stuff is going to die, so who cares? Just let it go. That was one of my things that I thought. No, I shouldn't think that way. It was sad that I thought that. I'm getting better now because I realize how important the Arctic is. Over time, I have realized that I may not want to go to the Arctic because I am scared about imitative mania. I mean, if other people are doing it, you might start doing it too, you know. But so this is what I think about the Arctic now. First of all, I think it's important. We can't just let it go. And in part, we have to think about it because, as Moran puts it, it's kind of an early warning system. It's kind of like what they call the canary in the coal mine, right? If something happens to the canary, oh, poor canaries. I don't know why we have to beat up on the canaries just to know, you know, if humans can live down there in the coal mine. But the point is, something is happening in one place, and you kind of use that as a general alarm for what might happen. So it's at least important to scientifically observe what is going on, because it seems like it's warming more than it should be. I also learned that, you know, the Arctic Ocean itself is currently absorbing carbon. So, I mean, like on the levels of I think they said on the levels of the rivers that flow into the Amazon, it's a huge deal. It's a big thing up there. Now, well, Cass, what is the potential problem though? What's going on up there? Yeah, it's pretty scary, I have to say. You got the tundra, which is this fragile thing. Then you got your snowmobiles, and other things going on, trying to farm it or something. So somebody gets excited that it's warming up and they want to plant something. The next thing you know, all that carbon that's sequestered, oh, what a great word, sequestered down there is all held in those soils. Might as well just say, yay, soil. You've been talking about soils and you said the soils are very important. But yeah, if that carbon, instead of absorbing the carbon and having it sequestered, that all starts coming out, it's going to be like, just accelerate the whole process. And then that is very scary. And then what could happen? There's something else that could happen. I don't know if you caught this because very few people know about this. Yes.
So they start exporting the soil that just got morphed and they just.
Actually, that sounds like a good business, buying Arctic soil, tundra. I think that's a good idea. But what could happen? So generally, we've been thinking about the carbon goes out and it's accelerating the process of global warming. There's something else weird that can happen, Louis.
The like cracked vehicles damaging the soil and stuff, damaging the plant.
Yeah, that's what's happening. And so it might accelerate the process, but there's something else. Do you all know about this? I don't want to scare you even more than you're already scared. Cast, you got it? Oh, I didn't even know about that. Okay, I'm learning so many things. I don't like that one. The bacteria from that is coming out too. We got enough problems. Yeah, Mickey. Methane, yeah, it's gonna be bad. All those gases and all those things up there. Okay, I won't. I'll stop torturing you. There are some people who speculate that the more things warm up, there's some other weird ocean current. And it's on page 106. I think it talks about a new glacial age. And it's kind of like the tipping point. And if you reverse this current or something happens with the oceans, I was reading various accounts of this, it brings on the next ice age. And you might be like, good, it'll stop global warming because we'll be in an ice age. Trust me, we do not want to have another ice age. That is probably worse than global warming, I think. I don't know. So maybe it'll all balance out, but it can go the other way too. You can look this up. I'm not making it up. The little ice age. Yeah, that's what happened before, right? Yeah, we get one of those again, basically. So I don't know. That's very speculative, but the point is we don't know. When we make these kinds of changes, like things can happen that you don't know about. You can write a paper about that one. But anyway, let's see. Wait a second. Oh, I'm supposed to end on an optimistic note and not just be like, hey, yikes. I think, like Moran, I'm going to be optimistic and say that we can see that people have adapted to some very extreme conditions and they've done some very cool things, and it's neat. And if we raise our children and biologically expose them to cold, not too much cold, but just enough cold that they'll get, being able to shiver without shivering, then, things can be good. So we need that indigenous knowledge and different ways to construct things and beat the ice out of our clothes and all that stuff. And flexibility. I mean, the Arctic peoples also show us that you don't just get stuck in the rut of tradition, and that ecological knowledge and indigenous knowledge is not just something that stays static. You adapt and you change and you be flexible over time. And Moran, and us, we're all going to believe that this is a good thing in terms of we're going to learn, we're going to adapt, we're going to be flexible, we're not gonna go into a new ice age, nor are we gonna go into 20 degrees higher. We're gonna stay right in the middle.